Hello, welcome back to Arkham with M. Ark M. It's bad. I just finished up the Draft and Die hard mode for Night of the Zealot. So we just played through a bunch of different draft scenarios and finally started recording on our third run through, where we actually managed to get a pair of investigators to blunder through the Night of the Zealot, and we got through it on hard mode. So I wanted to talk a little bit about all the things I've learned about this particular campaign, and sort of discuss like all of the different things that you need to know going into hard mode or nightmare mode, and like what kind of like tips and tricks you can bring in that might help you here. Just stuff that we've learned from actually drafting this campaign multiple times. I think at this point I've played Night of the Zealot on hard probably 10 times, and I've played Night of the Zealot and Return to the Night of the Zealot probably 20 or 30. So I've definitely had like a lot more experience with this campaign than with like any other campaigns. I kind of teaching it a lot, and I kind of getting stuck in Draft and Die on it. So we're going to talk about everything we know. As you may have guessed, there are going to be a ton of spoilers for this one. In particular, we're going to break down all of the cards, including all of the potential like alternates that you might see. So if you're a person who really wants to be surprised by what's around the bend in the encounter deck, this is probably not the video for you. But there are lots of interesting things to discuss. So we're going to talk about the design, and we're going to talk about how to win the campaign and how to do really well in the first scenarios, and also how to draft well, I guess, since that's the primary thing. We were building our decks mostly out of scraps from the core set and from the starter decks, and so we are going to be discussing a little bit like what kind of cards are going to be really beneficial here, as well as like what kind of general strategies you need to take. So first things first, let's talk about the token bag. When you're playing on hard mode, the token bag changes, but also this card flips. If you're actually looking for a gap between the standard and the very difficult hard, you can try just not flipping this card, because that will make all the difference in the world for the level of difficulty. But if you're upgrading the token bag, typically you also flip the card, and as a result you get different effects, such as the fact that you draw ghoul enemies, that you are revealing additional tokens and failing to take 2 horror, and on a -4, if there's a ghoul, you'll take damage in horror, whereas previously you just take a single damage. So it's just like it's a much harder version of the setup, and also notably the distribution of the chaos bag is different. So normally when you are in a standard game of Arkham and you're in something like the study and you're making an investigation check and you don't need to succeed it, but you really want to, and you just kind of want to have like a good average, you're generally going to aim for 2 above whatever the shroud value is. So for any check like that, you're just like, okay, I'll test 5 against 3 because there's enough -2s in the bag, and there's only one -3, one -4. So like we're just going to hit that super consistently. I think it's like so 12 out of 15 times that you'll hit exactly what you want, which is 4 and 5. And that's, that's pretty decent odds. That's the kind of average that you want to be aiming for. With the new distribution of the bag, there are 17 tokens, and the -4 and the -5 both significantly add to the difficulty of tests. Your baseline for a basic test that you want to succeed but don't have to succeed is now going to be pretty much at a -3, because there are 2 -3s in the bag, and also like the skulls themselves tend to do a lot more. -4 is even safer and can give you like a much better setup, but like in general, like because there are more tokens in the bag, -3 is kind of the baseline to aim for, whereas -4 is just like a really nice bonus, and -5 is the top end threshold. And you want to keep in mind that top end threshold as well. In standard mode or any mode that you're in, you always want to keep track of what the highest number in the bag that you can draw is, because that maximizes your chances of getting the exact thing that you want on tests that you can't afford to fail. So for example, if you're in the bedroom and you absolutely don't want to discard cards, you need to test a 5 against 2 in hard, or more than a 5 against 2, you need to test a 7 against 2 in hard. If you're fighting the Ghoul Priest, you need to be testing 9 against 4, because if you are not succeeding in these particular tests, the Ghoul Priest will attack you back. And like certain stuff like that, in particular Field of Graves and Ghoul Pits will have very big tests of speed and will that you really need to succeed, as well as like some small options. I think another good one that might be relevant is the Zealot Seal, is one where you just really need to succeed by exactly that much. So keep those numbers in mind, +5 and +3 for hard mode, and +2 and +4 for standard. They really matter, and like basically the idea is you shouldn't invest too much in most tests, but you should always be aware when you need to invest the highest amount in a particular test. All right, So that's the Chaos Bag. Let's talk about the agendas and the acts. All right, so first agenda, lead investigator flips for 2 horror at 3 doom. This happens pretty early, so the main thing that you really want to do is make sure that your lead investigator is either equipped to take horror or that each investigator is equipped to draw cards. Typically, the lead investigator is going to be somebody with decently high sanity. Oftentimes, it's going to be your seeker, which works out pretty okay, except that seeker allies are very good, and the lead investigator will have to take Lita Chandler after the game is over. I believe in between campaigns you can switch who the lead investigator is, but whoever has Lita Chandler will continue to have Lita Chandler in their deck, so make sure that your lead investigator is someone who's willing to take that ally and play them, because Lita Chandler is just generally very strong against a wide variety of the enemies in the game, and in addition you need to have her out in the third one, both as an insurance policy and as your primary method of defeating Yamordoth. So just some things to consider with the lead investigator really matter for the first agenda. For the second agenda, what's basically going to happen is you're going to draw a bunch of ghouls, and the enemies are going to start flooding into the hallway and the parlor after that point. Once this timer goes, basically everything will get very, very complicated very, very quickly. However, there are some ways to stall this 10-turn timer and have a pretty decent time with it. You can definitely take a couple of turns to get ready for the Ghoul Priest, probably even up to 4 doom without getting into too much trouble, if you can keep the ghouls out of the hallway and the parlor. If they're in the hallway and the parlor, the doom's going to advance very, very quickly. And of course, you also have to keep track of the ancient evils in the deck, because basically there is never as much time as you think there is. Ancient Evils is a card that is going to really sort of mess with your ability to deal with this timer. And the penalty for this timer, if you're not in the hallway, is in fact death. You'll lose the game if you don't have the act advanced to a certain point by the time this agenda flips. So keeping all the ghouls out becomes especially important if you're behind. As such, there are a couple of cards that are pretty relevant and will be relevant for the rest of the campaign. One of them is the Real Underdog Barricade. That card is not very good in most formats and most campaigns. However, it is actually very strong in the hallway for any characters who can stand to sit in the hallway for a decent period of time. There's notably a bit of a disconnect here, where basically Seekers are the ones who typically have Barricade, and Seekers are the ones who need to go and get clues. But if the Seekers already have the level 4 clues in the cellar, then you can feasibly stand in the hallway while your Guardians grab stuff in the attic, and basically just sit there with a Barricade up. All the ghouls that spawn in the bathroom and the bedroom will just sort of bump up against the hallway. All the ghouls who spawn in the attic and the cellar, same basic thing. And then you can break the barricade. You don't even have to break the barricade. You can actually advance the act, stay in the barricade for the entire course of the game, kill the Ghoul Priest, and keep all of the other ghouls out. So that's a notable strategy that is pretty relevant. It's not as good here as it is going to be when you upgrade the barricade in level 3, but it's something to keep track of. The other card that tends to be an all-star from the core set is Dynamite. If you're playing with standard or hard, the ability to just blow up a couple of ghouls at the same time ends up being pretty powerful. And it also gives your rogues with evasion significantly more to do, which is something that we can talk about a little bit, because evasion is not terribly strong in this campaign. But if you have Dynamite, that's going to be useful later in the campaign for sure. Upgrading it, again, very good, but if you have Dynamite, you can typically kill or damage a lot of the ghouls and keep them a little bit more under control. Other stuff like Get Over Here, anything that allows you to move the ghouls around or shove them into the attic or cellar, or even just push them into the guest hall. If you can in any way sort of pull the ghouls, then you can get them out of the hallway and engage them and do that. Another option is to have a tanky guardian, take a ghoul in the hallway, move them into the guest hall, and then just stay engaged with them until they're done fighting. So anything that's big and difficult, if you can actually get it out of the way, then that's really, really useful. Keep that in mind. It's fairly handy for the course of the game. All right. So that's the agendas. At the end of this last agenda, obviously you'll either lose or die, depending on whether or not you've opened up the parlor. Yeah, there's a lot of bad things going on there. So for the act deck, we have 3 different phases. We have first off the phase where you're trying to get these 6 clues for 2 investigators. It's 3 and then 4 per each for each setup. And let's talk a little bit about this one, because this is kind of interesting. The Study has the Draw 3 Cards ability. I think this ability is not very useful in 2-player and 1-player games, because it's a pretty significant investment of actions for a lot of cards. Like, you are getting 2 actions for 3 card draws, so you're saving 1 action on card draws. If your character really needs hand size to activate themselves, I think Higher Education is a particularly important one, because it's a base core set card, and Harvey Walters, of course, has some decent card draw as well. Then you might want to consider these actions. On the other hand, cards like the Harvey Walters Draw 3 Preposterous Sketches is just as good and takes 1 action, and then you can play resources off of your like cryptic writings and things like that, so you may not even need to use this ability. And characters who don't have to use this ability will have a slightly easier time, because they'll be able to advance the timer a little bit faster. This is a race against the clock. The Ancient Evils are going to be like sort of your biggest enemy for this, just due to the fact that like once the Ancient Evils flips the second time, the timer gets really nuts. So solving these clues as fast as possible and getting into this area is pretty relevant. I think that because time is of such essence, good action economy is really relevant, of course. It always is, but in this case in particular, you're on a pretty decent race. And also, you generally want to set up assets, but you only want to set up assets for most of the things that you're going to be dealing with early on. Like, Guardians need just enough guns to deal with like 1 or 2 elites. You don't want to get like too crazy on the setup phase here unless you think that it's going to let you breeze through the rest of the campaign. So like, it's a little bit difficult to set it up otherwise. You do have about 10 turns of Doom, but that also includes some Ancient Evils, and it also includes some, I believe, reshuffling of the encounter deck. Oh, no, not so far. So there are 3 Ancient Evils in the encounter deck, so if you let the 10 Doom go by and you're a deck of like 4 people, you'll see all 3 of those Ancient Evils. So you really only have about 7 turns to be active. On another note, cancel the Ancient Evils. If you have any type of card that cancels a treachery effect when it's drawn, Ancient Evils is the card that those cards are designed for. A lot of the other cards will be bad for you, but drawing an Ancient Evils and canceling it will buy your allies at least 6 different additional actions, up to 12 for 4 players, and give you just a wild amount of extra time to play with. So having Ward of Protection, having, I believe it's Will to Survive, and I believe there's one in Survivor that you place a clue. If you have like On the Hunt or any sort of like Guardian tech that allows you to avoid Ancient Evils, basically just anything, number of things that shift treacheries around, really handy in these cases. And the Rogue, you handle this one is great because you can hand the Ancient Evils off to your Ward of Protection character and just have them negate it. Always good stuff. The more you do this, it's true in every single mode, the more you do this, the better off you are, the more experience you're going to gain in the course of the campaign. The Bathroom has a ability that causes you to lose all remaining actions and end your turn. So early characters like Guardians who want to do some investigating and aren't afraid of like, say, a ghoul spawning in the Study and killing your Seeker, should be doing things like move, investigate on the Bathroom. You want to try to investigate the Bathroom on your last turn to get that last clue. Sometimes it will be unavoidable. You'll just have to spin the wheel on this thing in order to try and get the most clues possible, but that can cost you a lot of turns if you're stuck in the Bathroom for too long. So keep it in mind, reveal the Bathroom, and just immediately go to town on the options. There will be an elite that spawns here eventually, so Guardians can do stuff like move, investigate, end up getting the elite, shoot the elite twice, and then investigate again, and just like get a lot of results out of that. This is also a decent place to use your clueless tests if you want to like really get some like extra economy out of this. The highest shroud value in this area is 4. And there isn't a higher one anywhere else in the area. In fact, there are like only 2 that are 4, and it's the Cellar and the Ghoul Pits. So like, as long as you're comfy with like most of the other shroud values, this is a decent place to use your skill tests, because it's a higher chance for failure than a lot of the other things that there are. It's about like a 5 in 17 to suddenly lose your entire turn if you're not using your particular clue sets there. The Bedroom is a little less important. You just need to remember that if you're failing, you're going to have to discard cards at random from your hand. So if you have a particularly key piece of tech, be careful about investigating the Bedroom at your base skill value. But normally you're just going to go 5 against 2 here. It's not going to be a huge deal if you end up discarding a card. It'll cost you some tempo, but it's probably worth it just for like the ability to go after it, and you're not terribly likely to fail most of the time. So important to note. Okay, once you have those 6 clues, you flip the act deck. You get a 4-cost will test that causes an investigator to fail to discard random cards from their hands. So this doesn't have any sort of like will or horror penalty to it. So an empty-handed character can do just as well as a high will character. But that's sort of your call. Generally, you'll know which investigators you want to do, and you have that ability to sort of figure that out in advance, since all of the investigators will actually have to be in the guest hall in order to spend the clues that you have. That doesn't necessarily mean that an investigator with no clues can't do that, but like it is relevant in that respect. Okay. Once you open up the hallway, that's when the ghoul priest spawns. So the important thing to remember, there are 2 things. One is that like a very, very common error for people is to go into the hallway and then they think that they can flip the act deck and spawn the ghoul priest during their turn. So they'll be like, I have 2 actions left, we'll just flip the act deck. And they're like, oh no, it's a ghoul priest. And they get attacked by the ghoul priest, and then things are really, really bad. A couple of things like that doesn't work. You can only actually advance this act at the end of the round. So when the round ends, investigators in the hallway. So keep that in mind, because I think that's a really common mistake that most players make. This happens at the end of your upkeep phase, so it's after the enemy phase. You're not going to get attacked by the ghoul priest, and you'll have a full turn to deal with it. That's why it happens at the end of the round in the first place. But also keep in mind that you don't have to spend those clues once you are all in the hallway. You can take some time, set up the gear that you need to kill the ghoul priest in 1 turn if possible, and make sure that your Seeker is ready to make the run to lead a Chantler if you're playing in a large player game. I think 3 to 4 players, lead a Chantler is always worth it. In 2 players, the extra damage from lead a Chantler is okay, but a Seeker can also just use I've Got a Plan or Occult Invocation to help out with damage while the Guardian deals 2 damage per pop. Since the Ghoul Priest only has 10 health in that particular situation, the Guardian's going to do 2, 4, 6, 7, and then the Seeker can follow up with an additional +3 from an Occult Invocation or something like that if you're playing with a pair. So like keep in mind that all you really need to do is that amount of damage for the Ghoul Priest, but you've got some interesting available options if you want to actually get that going. In the larger campaigns, it's actually much, much better to grab Lead a Chantler. The Seeker's move is basically always going to be move, parlay with Lead a Chantler, move back to the hallway. If they have to parlay with Lead a Chantler twice, the Guardian will have to drag the Ghoul Priest into the hallway next. But whoever's got the Ghoul Priest engaged can just send them in and get them ready for many multi-damage attacks that deal +3 damage. Lead a Chantler's incredible. She gives a +1 fight. She gives the extra damage to investigators, and she's just got a ton of soak, including enough soak to deal with at least 1 hit from the Ghoul Priest. So successfully parlaying with Lead a Chantler is typically key to winning the mission, particularly in high player counts. I think this is a very important aspect of the game, like basically just be ready for the Ghoul Priest, gear up, and then go in. But keep in mind that the longer that you stay, the more the elite ghouls are going to pop up, and if you're in the late stages of the game, ghouls are going to spawn and continue to move into the hallway, and there's not much you can do about it, so you have to be a little bit careful to not let the doom tick too close to 10, because a single ghoul spawning in the hallway on top of the Ghoul Priest can lead to a lot of different problems. And most notably, you're always going to get 2 doom during the Mythos phase, because the Ghoul Priest spawns in the hallway, and then when the Ghoul Priest spawns in the hallway, that means you get 2 doom during the actually, no, you don't get a doom on the agenda for the ghoul at the end of the round. That all happens at the same time. Okay, more things to learn. All right. So yeah, once you're through the first act and into the second act, you will have to go through the cellars and the attics. If you're in Return to, this is where the game actually gets a lot more difficult than the previous one. Hallway and bathroom are certainly pretty rough rooms, and they do have a lot of like extra actions associated with investigating them. But I do think that as far as the attics are concerned, drawing either of the alternate versions significantly diminishes your chance of getting the most experience possible in a campaign, as well as your chance of actually winning the scenario. So the main reason for that is that whatever it is that you draw that draws deep below your house or far above your house will actually give you a second location. It won't give you a victory point if you steal this location, and this location is going to have the 2 clues that you need divided between these 2 areas. So that is like a little difficult because it divides a lot of the clues up, so you can't like mass deduction pilfer them, that type of thing. If you're in large player campaigns, that's not going to matter quite as much, but if you're in like a 2-player campaign, like a card like pilfer is just not useful in this one because it doesn't get you 3 clues anywhere. There's actually very, very few places that will give you 3 clues, and the cellar and attic spawn only 50% of the time. In addition, the Ghoul Pits has a rougher time than the Cellar or Attic. Cellar Attic have repeatable effects that deal you damage and deal you horror, which does cause you to accumulate some damage and horror. It's helpful to be able to heal that or soak that with allies. But compared to the 4 will test that causes everyone to discard a pile of cards, which if you are not prepared for may actually be like the worst thing that you can have happen when you go into an attic. Like in this scenario, it's probably the most devastating effect if you fail this test on an auto fail compared to basically anything else, including taking 4 damage from the Ghoul Priest on Retaliate, or 2 damage from the Ghoul Priest on Retaliate. It's a really, really rough blow to go into the Field of Graves. And so, if you do draw the alternate attic or cellar, and you think that you're a little bit behind, I recommend checking out the other area as well, just clearing the first part of this area as clues, and not going into these higher skill value areas because they're difficult shroud tests to start with, and they're also like really, really rough in terms of like what type of tests they're going to give you. The Ghoul Pits is notable because it's the only speed test in Return to the Night of the Zealot, and if you fail it, you do get a lot of extra rats, which is not always a great thing. Certain characters can make very good use of it. I think Guardians can sort of deliberately fail it to try and do like Roland Banks evidence type stuff, but by and large, you're usually not going to be doing a lot with this. So just keep that in mind. These 2 tests are pretty scary, so if you get the alternate one, try to clear the big areas like the attic 1 or the cellar 1 before you try to go into the cellar 2 and then the Field of Graves. If you just clear the cellar and then you clear the attic 2 with the 2 clues on it, then you've got the 6 clues you need to proceed, and the same is true if it's 9 clues or 12 clues. Like, you're just capable of actually getting through without going into these areas, so keep it in mind that they are the ones that are going to mess with you the most in terms of keeping you away from the Ghoul Priest. In addition, there are 2 locations away from the hallway, which actually does add up to a lot of extra actions per turn and a lot more organizing and keeping everybody separate and basically just not being within range of your Guardian. It's a tougher time because of these 2 areas, and if you can avoid going into them at all, that's a really good idea. On the other hand, if you draw both of these, the Attic 2 and the Cellar 2, then, you know, you're just kind of out of luck. So you'll have to go into one of them and pick the one that you're best at. All right, so that's the scenario. The main thing to remember about this, apart from that, is the encounter deck. Counter deck is full of ghouls. Notably, when you are drawing that -2, you have to search for a ghoul enemy and draw it. Keep this in mind because in smaller player counts, you're not always going to encounter all of the elite enemies, and if you're trying to earn experience, you actually do want to encounter all of the elite enemies, and not only that, but you sometimes don't want to encounter a ghoul when you fail a -2, particularly if you're a seeker. So what you can do is you can search for something like the Ghoul from the Depths, and then you can immediately spawn it into the bathroom. Like, it's just going to go into the bathroom, and it's not going to jump on your face if you're in the bedroom or in the attic or in the cellar. That can be a problem if you're in the attic and the cellar and you spawn something in the bathroom, because that means the Guardian has to go get it before it starts coming back. But it does spawn victory points elsewhere, and it keeps you clear of the other ghouls which have issues that are a little bit trickier to evade or kill. Grave Eater is not like a bad card, but it is a bad card for a Seeker to get stuck to, and Acolyte of Immordoth is, of course, never a better card than the Grave Eater to draw, unless you really, really think that you can kill it in one turn without much issue. You know, getting these ghouls out of the deck means that all you're going to be facing after that is will tests. So this is true of the campaign and the scenario in particular. The scenario is particularly egregious, but it is actually a prelude, as is often the case with scenarios, to the ultimate scenario of this one, the Devourer Below, in that it has a lot of will tests, and there are a lot of will tests in this one. In Return to, not only do you have Crypt Chill, but you also have the Zealot's Seal, and you also, of course, have the standard ones of Chill from Below, and Frozen in Fear. Frozen in Fear, when stuck to a rogue character with 1 will, or any character that doesn't have a good will value, can be one of the most devastating things for your action economy. Particularly in low player campaigns where every character is going to matter a lot more due to their higher increased percentage of the role that they need to play. A Guardian with Frozen in Fear is going to have a hard time the first turn that this is out, regardless of what you're doing. The This is another treachery that's actually worth canceling sometimes if you're really trying to save some extra space. It won't always save you like more than one action, but it is something that does save you quite a bit and can be pretty useful in that respect. I wouldn't prioritize this over Ancient Evils, but if you've got extra cancels, this is probably one of the things that you're going to be going towards the most. And, you know, the Zealot Seal affects everybody, so there's just a lot of will tests here. Make sure that your characters are carrying their amulets or whatever it is that boosts their will. Make sure they have allies that boost their will, and make sure that they can afford to take some horror damage or discard some cards if they can't pass will tests, because otherwise they're just going to have a lot more problems. Rogues who can't pass will tests need to be able to draw a lot of cards and need to be able to soak a lot of horror, and anyone else who can't pass will tests kind of needs to do the same. Beyond that, you have a couple of other things that are going to be like significantly less threatening. Probably the best card to draw is typically Obscuring Fog. While it does mess with certain low book value investigators, it often attaches to empty areas because the guest hall and the hallway are both empty, and you'll often be ending your turn in those areas. And also you'll frequently be clearing all of the clues of one of these places and then spawning an Obscuring Fog there. It will just constantly attached there. There's nothing too crazy happening with that one. So one of the easiest encounters to face. Dissonant Voices is something you can play around typically. Keep in mind that it will show up every now and then. If you decide to stick around and like prep for the ghoul and you still have Dissonant Voices in the deck, that's something that can really mess with your overall battle plan, because you won't be able to do anything that turn. You'll just have wasted a turn while like sitting there with guns in hand. So trying to play cards like when you can actually play them does matter, and trying to investigate skill tests when you can't is also really solid. Just adapt to the deck on that respect, but keep a high will value, keep enough fight and damage to deal with the large number of ghouls, because there are 4 different elites in this particular format, and all of them will eventually be coming for the hallway. The more you kill, the more experience you gain, the more better off you'll be dealing with the Midnight Masks, which is, you know, pretty high value. So hunting these actively is really nice if you have a really good Guardian. Nathaniel Cho's really strong here. Anyone with a high fight value, Mark Harrigan, a lot of the like early investigators are going to be really strong. Roland Banks is probably not going to be wanting to chase every single ghoul down, because getting Roland Banks to pass that many 4 fight skill tests, especially on hard, is a little bit difficult. But you can typically get quite a few of them, and sometimes even all of them, while still getting the Ghoul Priest at the end. So keep that in mind. There's just a lot of health of enemies, and then beyond that, it's just will tests all the way. All right. That about sums up everything I have to say about Night of the Zealot. This is definitely a time crunch one. You want to act pretty fast. You want to not take as much time to set up as you would in slower campaigns, and you want to basically like work really quickly. That's going to be a theme, I think, for all 3 of the scenarios. Is just like speed is kind of an issue. This is the one place where rogues tend to shine. If they can actually get a lot of action economy, then they can often do a lot of the same things that Seekers can do, and in a Guardian fashion, by just dealing lots of extra damage or moving lots of extra locations and getting these places like all set up and pulling the clues off of them very quickly. But in order to do the rogue things, you're actually going to, I would say that rogues have the hardest time in these particular campaigns, in this particular campaign, because they are going to be constantly low on cards. They typically have very poor will values. They get Frozen in Fear stuck to them a lot, and they don't have any evade tests to make. You basically just don't really want to go into the ghoul pits if you don't have to, and if you do, like, that's the one speed test that you're going to make. Beyond that, Guardians pair really well with Seekers. Mystics also pair really well with basically Seekers or Survivors, and Survivors often work very well in the clue role. I have found Stella Clark to be really fantastic here, as well as Harvey Walters, Daisy Walker, just lots and lots of people who can do lots and lots of things. Daisy has a little bit of a tougher time because she has to get books down to get her action economy going, and laying down assets will slow you down a little bit in the early game, which can lead to the timer ticking a little bit faster in the late game. But Daisy can also carry Word of Protections, which is something that other Seekers and Survivors can't necessarily do. So that's a pretty relevant thing, due to the fact that it buys you a whole turn on Ancient Evils and gives you a lot of extra bonuses. I think that's a pretty comprehensive breakdown. So we talked about Barricade and Dynamite. Those are two really, really important cards. Under lower campaign settings, remember that spawning 4 clues is actually pretty rare in all 3 of these scenarios, actually. There will be 1 4th clue location in 1 to 2 4th clue locations in Midnight Masks, a 50% chance of two 50% chances of getting 4 clues in this one, and beyond that, like, you're basically not going to have that many that actually have a lot of clues per investigator in a 2-player campaign. So keep that in mind if you're taking cards like Pilfer that steal 2 additional clues, or any sort of cards where you get like just a ton of clues all at once. Those cards are really good most of the time. Working a Hunch is still really, really strong here, so is basically anything else that grabs you a ton of clues. Is Working a Hunch the one that's when you have 12 cards in hand, it's basically free? I can't remember which one that is, but like, yeah, those cards are still very useful, but I have noticed that Pilfer in particular is not as strong in 2-player campaigns. So keep that in mind. The number of clues that you're investigating is, like, this is a small scenario. You're not going to see every possible situation, so certain cards will not be as good, whereas other cards will be significantly good because the situations, the really, like, you know, weird situations that you normally wouldn't see them in are going to show up a little bit more often. Like, for example, ghouls are generally humanoid, so if you bring handcuffs, you can handcuff ghouls, and I'm pretty sure they can't move. I can't remember. I feel like I'm pretty sure it's like every ready ghoul at the end. Each unengaged ghoul. No, even ghouls with handcuffs move. Ugh, handcuffs is a terrible card. So yeah, like, you know, there are just like certain cards that will serve you a little bit better in these situations, and it's worth it to try and grab them. All right, that does it for this wrap-up of the Gathering. And if you like this, we'll do one for Midnight Mask and Devour below as well. If not, well, we're continuing with our Draft and Die, and feel free to tune in for that. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Cheers.